Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's webinar on postgraduate study in the USA. My name is Holly Haig and I am one of two Education USA advisors here at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. In today's webinar, we're going to cover sort of the three main pillars of the application process, including choosing a university and that kind of research process, putting together an application and funding. And just a couple of housekeeping pieces. We will be having a Q&A section at the end. So I would encourage you, if you've got a pen and paper, to maybe keep a couple of notes of any questions that come up throughout the presentation. Hopefully in the content, I'll be able to cover some of those off. But if you do have any questions towards the end, I'm happy to have a go at those in the Q&A box at the end. So if you could hold questions until then, that would be wonderful. And other than that, I'd also like to just note that this webinar is being recorded, so don't feel like you have to frantically write everything that I say down. You'll also be getting a link to the recording after this that you can refer to at your leisure in your own time as well. Quickly to just introduce myself, as I said, my name is Holly. I'm an Education USA advisor. I'm originally from here in the UK, but I did my undergraduate degree in the US, so have some of that insight into what it's like to be a British student in the US. So I can definitely kind of speak to some of my personal experience as we go through. Other than that, let's dive right in. And I'm quickly going to go over a little bit more about Education USA and Fulbright and the kind of work that we do. So as I mentioned, the US-UK Fulbright Commission, it kind of hosts our Education USA services. Fulbright was founded around 70 years ago, just after World War II, by Senator Fulbright, who was a US senator. And he believed that the best way to avoid a Third World War from happening was to promote peace and intercultural understanding and exchange through education. And so that is exactly what our goals are as an organisation to achieve. And so how do we do this? There are a few main ways. One way in particular that many of you may be familiar with is through our Fulbright Awards, which are grants for postgraduate study in the US. However, we also promote this in the capacity that I represent through our Education USA advisory service. So here at Education USA, we offer free, up-to-date, non-biased information about US study to students here in the UK. And we are part of a global network of advisors. I think there are around 600 of us in 400 centres across the world. So if your dream and your goal and ambition is to go and study in the US, this is something that we are here to help you with, both at the master's and PhD level. Great. So before we get started into some of those main topics that I mentioned at the beginning, I first want to just cover off why might a student in the UK want to study in the US? Now up on screen, I have listed just a handful of some of the top reasons that we see British students studying in the US. By no means is this an exhaustive list, and I'm sure that all of you have your own reasons for being interested in it, but I'll just quickly go through some of these top ones. First off, we've got a wide range of choices. Here in the UK, we have about 120 universities offering postgraduate programs, whereas in the US, there are over 1,700 universities offering postgraduate degrees. So straight away, a lot of variety and flexibility, and also that diversity and variety is really present amongst academic departments within those universities. You'll see a lot of variance and variety to really cater to what it is that you'd like to get out of your postgraduate experience. And we'll talk about that later on as we move through the presentation. Next up, we've got internationalizing your CV. Employers often cite cross-cultural understanding and skills as a really attractive quality in their application process. And it's really helpful to have that diverse experience and to demonstrate independence necessary to studying abroad in later life. Also got this piece about global networking, whether that's professionally but also academically. Not only will you be amongst lots of American faculty and things like that, but you'll also have an unparalleled opportunity to create global networks further afield with a really diverse range of colleagues, whether that's students from across the world, very international set of faculty as well. Next up, we've got practical experience. So at US universities, there tend to be many opportunities for hands-on research where students are really able to get involved, alongside internship opportunities and teaching opportunities that are really common too. Likewise, this idea of expanding your horizons. So living and studying abroad in another country, again, something I can really vouch for, is a way to really expand your worldview and might expand some opportunities that are available to you in the future. And last but not least, which may be surprising to some of you, is the availability of funding opportunities that are often on offer at US universities. There are a lot of funding schemes and scholarships available on the postgraduate level, and we'll talk about these in some more depth later on. Great. Again, just want to dive into a couple of key differences between the US and the UK when it comes to postgraduate qualifications. And this will be particularly helpful to bear in mind as you're doing your research, because you'll probably see a couple of these factors coming up, just to kind of get familiar with them. First thing to note is the length of programs in the US. So typically you are going to see that they are slightly longer. If you're doing a master's program, you'll tend to see that US programs are 2 years long. There are 1 year programs out there, but they're a little bit more rare. And if you're doing a PhD, again, this will be slightly longer, somewhere between 4 to 6 years, as compared to about 3 to 5 here in the UK. But again, this may be more or less depending on the department and on the program, etc. Another thing to note is that in the US, masters are integrated into PhDs, which means that for your first year or two, for those of you who've already done a master's and are planning to do a PhD in the US, this is really a time to hone in on any skills that you might be using later on in your research, and to gain more experience with things like teaching or doing research as an assistant, because typically that integrated master's piece is not an optional part of the course, and so you wouldn't be able to necessarily apply an existing master's towards that PhD program. You would be expected to take that first couple of years to really hone in on those skills and again practice some of those hands-on skills. Another thing to note is that there tends not to be pure research programs in the US. Programs usually will include coursework at the postgraduate level, so something to bear in mind in terms of fit and your interests. Another thing which we'll get onto in the application process area of this presentation is that there are no set standards when it comes to US education. There is no set kind of application fee, no set fees when it comes to actually attending university, and no set deadlines for applying. Each program sets their own deadlines, fees, etc. And there's going to be a wide variety about what that looks like from department to department and course to course. So definitely something to be aware of as you're going into that research process. Another thing to bear in mind is that postgraduate programs are largely organised by the department as a whole and not by a specific supervisor. So you don't need to know your supervisor in advance, especially since some programs are more interdisciplinary. And so you might have multiple supervisors or a committee of supervisors. And you also tend not to need an in-depth research proposal in the same way that you would here in the UK. This is usually something that you're expected to figure out with the support of your supervisors as you begin your programme. And then finally, one last thing to point out, if this is of interest to any of you, is that law and medicine are both programs that are studied on the postgraduate level in the US as opposed to the undergraduate level. And I'm happy to take any questions relating to those during the Q&A. Great. So again, just before we dive into some of those specifics to do with researching a university and choosing a program, I'm going to briefly go over a timeline of what to expect and some of those key components in the process. Again, as I mentioned, there's no set deadlines rather for particular universities, and they're all going to vary significantly. So you might have to adjust slightly, but this is kind of a general overview of what to expect. So you will begin to research your universities as the first and probably most important step in the process. We recommend that you begin this somewhere between 12 to 18 months before you plan to enroll at a university. Then you'll finalise a selection of where you'll be applying around 10 to 12 months before you plan to enrol. And around this same time, you'll have a look and see if there are any required admissions exams, and begin your applications, and you'll sit those exams. About 8 to 10 months before you plan to enrol, you'll then put together your application and submit them according to those varying deadlines. Then, sort of in the springtime, perhaps 4 to 7 months before you head out to the US, you'll then expect to hear back from the different universities with their admissions decisions. And based off where you're accepted, you will notify the various departments and universities, and you'll then go on and apply for your US student visa, usually in that summer period before you plan to move out to the US, so about 1 to 3 months before you enroll. You can then check out our pre-departure resources on our website for some of those more practical steps to get some of those last-minute logistics sorted, things like, travel advice, living arrangements, campus life. And then in around mid-August to early September, so slightly earlier than we're used to seeing here in the UK, you will head out to the US and begin your studies. Great, so I'm now going to dive in and talk a little bit more about that research piece and choosing a university. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are over 1,700 universities offering postgrad qualifications in the US. So there are a lot of options out there, and each institution and department is just so different. So with that in mind, how do you go about narrowing down your options and figuring out where it is you'd actually like to apply? Something that we focus on a lot here at Education USA and at the Fulbright Commission is this idea of fit. And what this means is that we want for students to find programs that are really going to be a good fit for them, whether that's for their personal or academic interests, but also thinking, financially, whether that's a good fit university. So this usually entails not just looking at universities that you've heard of, universities that you've seen in films or heard of in Legally Blonde, or, ones that are the highest ranked consistently. Instead, you're going to take this approach of locating factors that are most important to get out of your postgrad experience. And so there are many factors, and again, these will vary person to person on what's important to you. But there are many to consider both inside and outside of the classroom, from types of programs and departments that you're interested in, location. The US is very geographically diverse and spans several different time zones. So do you want to be in a more sunny climate, or do you really enjoy skiing and want to be in the snow some time of year? Availability of funding, as I mentioned, might be really important. As you begin to think about these factors, you're then going to want to broadly prioritize them. So, what kind of culture do you want in the department? Is it more competitive or collaborative? What size of cohort or faculty are you interested in? What about research opportunities and expertise? And then, as I was saying, that sort of availability of funding might be a factor for you. But then you also might want to think of other more strategic factors about, if you're trying to save some money, perhaps living in an urban place might cost more than being somewhere a little bit more suburban or rural. So having to think about some of those factors and then broadly prioritizing them. Again, just popping up some more to think about here. This idea of types of institution, you've got private and public universities. Private universities, just for some context, tend to be a little bit more expensive in their cost of attendance than public universities, and each have different environments as to what it's like to be a student there. You've got the program type. At the postgraduate level, this is arguably more important than the institution itself, because a lot of the things that you'll be working on day to day and a lot of your experience will be determined by the program staff and the academic department. So you'll want to consider things like your career goals, your qualifications, any concentrations that you might be interested in pursuing, but also how those line up with the expertise of the faculty. You know, it's generally that academic department that handles admissions, it handles the design course structure, and is also involved in kind of monitoring your progression throughout. So definitely worth keeping in mind, and because they can really vary drastically in terms of faculty expertise, you know, what concentrations are available, opportunities for teaching and research, as well as internship opportunities. Are they tightly focused on a particular topic, or are they more interdisciplinary in their nature? So really tailoring that to what you're interested in. As I said, location can be really important on a more superficial way in terms of kind of weather and things like that. But also you might want to be thinking about access to transportation options, whether you're going to be in a city where you can commute in easily, or a small campus where you are within walking distance, or might you need to be thinking about having a car or something like that to get around. Another thing you might think about is access to extracurricular activities or particular centres of excellence in particular fields. If you're into your politics, you might be looking to be based somewhere around the Washington, DC area, for example. Similarly, Boston, you might be thinking healthcare, or California if you're interested in, you know, being in film or something like that. So those are another thing to think about. And of course, we've got finances up here. We'll talk about these in more depth later on in the webinar. But if funding is important for you, it needs to be part of your choosing process right from the beginning. Because unlike here in the UK, where we tend to apply for funding later on in the process, it's something that happens simultaneously to the admissions process in many cases in the US. And so you don't want to kind of just think about that later on as an afterthought. It needs to be something that is on your radar from the get-go to avoid disappointment later down the line. Okay, great. So with all of these factors in mind, what are some ways in which you can narrow down your options? On our website, we have got a page all about choosing a university, which includes a long list of helpful links and search engines to help you do that, such as findaphd.com and gradschools.com. There's also a really useful guide, which I'm going to walk you through a quick example of, just so you can get a sense of this, called Peterson's. Peterson's search is a really helpful tool because you can actually rank which factors are most important to you, and by answering a series of questions, the website will create a list of programs that they think you might be interested in, as well as links to the university's websites. Another really helpful tool that you can use is your existing networks. So you might want to get in touch with, you know, previous professors or colleagues, see whether they've got any advice or opinions on schools that might be a good fit for you. Or, you know, particular areas, particular schools in your field or area of study. And then another great tip is to think about work that you've read before, perhaps as part of an undergraduate program or a master's program that really excites you or interests you. Where are those publications coming out of in the US? You know, where are those people teaching? Where are their colleagues based? What are they working on? So having a look into that might give you some leads into particular areas of interest for you. Okay, so I'm now going to walk through a little example for Peterson's, which is one of these search engines that is linked on our website. So here, just in this example, I have put in anthropology as our area of study that we're interested. And so we'll be looking up anthropology. And by searching here, we have Also, you can see down here, you can add different filters. So you can add something more specific. You can also add location, whether you're interested in which degree type, things like that. So we have highlighted some of these anthropology programs that have come up towards the top. And you can see that also on the search engine, we get an idea of how difficult admission is. You also get an idea of the type of school, whether it's public or private, where it's based, and also the number of students that are enrolled in their graduate programs. So it's a good way to kind of get that overview. And then from here, for example, if you were going to explore Whittier College some more, you can click on this and it's very interactive. You can go in and see more information in kind of highlight form. And it will also have a link to Whittier College's website to learn more information. Great. So once you've leveraged search engines like these, just to get an overall overarching view on what it is you're looking for and some of those highlights in your university research, you'll want to kind of narrow them down to about 10 that you'll then go on to conduct even more in detail research on the university website, and perhaps, you know, start to reach out to them directly, get to know some of the faculty via email and what they're involved in. And your goal will be to select about 4 to 6 institutions where you'll then actually go on to submit an application. So on the university website, when you're doing this more in-depth research, you can find more information on faculty members. Some of them will even list their CVs and their research interest, and sometimes even a list of their publications. So it's really a good idea to have a look through those, get a sense of what they're working on and what they're passionate about, because it's likely, as I mentioned earlier, that that will determine a lot of the course materials and course offerings is based on faculty interest. Sometimes on the university website, as well, as I mentioned, you'll find specific information about contact details for particular professors, and this idea of, you know, perhaps having an exchange with them to find out what they're currently working on and how you might be able to get involved with their research as a student. Another great thing that many universities offer is contact details to reach out to current graduate students at the university, which can be really valuable in terms of insight into their experience as a graduate student at that particular university. You know, you might want to ask them what kinds of projects they're working on and a little bit more about, you know, how close are their relationships with other peers or with faculty members. You know, what is the campus culture like? And then you also might ask them more broad questions like about what it's like to live in the local area, where are the best places to live, you know, what's the cost of living like? So it can be really good, you know, to get that insight as well. And sometimes departments can put you in touch with particular students who'll be able to talk to you in more depth about that. Great. So that was a bit of an overview about that choosing and research process. And as I said, a great starting point is our website to get some more in-depth information and resources to help you with that. Now I'm going to move on to an overview about completing an application. And, you know, when you get familiar with those universities that you've researched, it's really important to kind of go in and have a look about what is required of you as part of each university's application process. These are going to vary significantly, but in this section, I'm going to give you a bit of a general overview about some of those main components about what to expect when you're putting together those application materials. Okay, first off, I think it's really important to just get a bit of a general sense of what are US universities on the whole looking for from their applicants. Now, of course, some of the detail is going to be very different if you're applying to an MBA program versus, I don't know, molecular physics program, for example. But just to give you an overview, these are some of the main criteria. First off, we've got academic achievement, which is predominantly going to be measured by your undergraduate degree, or, you know, if applicable, your postgraduate degree results. But they may also be asking for things like your A-level or IB or higher or equivalent as well, to make that academic picture, to just get a more well-rounded view of that. They also might be looking at things like admissions test scores, which we'll talk about later on. But, you know, again, it's going to vary in what they're looking for in terms of grading. On the whole, you'll see that most will look for a 2.2 or above in a bachelor's degree program, but you'll want to maybe contact individual departments or programs about whether your qualifications will be sufficient to be considered for admissions, if you do have any queries or doubts about that. You'll find that US universities won't have sort of strict entry requirements in the way that UK universities do, but they should be able to give you an approximate idea of whether your academic profile is roughly on par with their usual admitted students. So definitely worth reaching out if you do have queries on that. Next up, we've got this idea of academic fit, and we talked about fit before. This is now this idea of your academic fit. So, you know, how does your interest in what you're studying fit in with the kind of university's approach to this? So are you going to thrive somewhere that's very research heavy, or are you going to thrive in an environment that's perhaps more practical and hands-on, where you are learning as you go? They might also want to know a little bit more about your reasons for pursuing a postgraduate program at their institution in particular, and how it helps towards your goals and future plans. As part of this, they also might look at, you know, relevant work experience or coursework that you've taken part in. And they'll perhaps be looking more for kind of a pattern amongst this, you know, laying a strong academic and practical foundations to your studies, as well as your ability and interest to be involved in and outside of the classroom, which kind of builds into this extracurricular involvement piece. You know, oftentimes programs in the US are very close-knit, and so faculty will also want to get a sense of who they're admitting to this program and how they're going to get involved outside of the classroom as well. Great. So moving on then into some of those more specifics for application components themselves. I just want to flag before I delve into these that, again, there's no standard process across all applications, and it will vary from university to university. Again, each university will set its own deadlines and requirements, so just to be really vigilant as you do your research for those. But most applications on the whole will follow a similar format, and you may be able to reuse and adapt certain application materials that you've used for one application for another page. Okay, so first off, we've got an application form. This is pretty standard. It will have sort of your basic information, contact details, a little bit of your background, that type of thing. Then some universities, not all, will ask for admissions exam scores. Again, we'll talk about that in some depth in just a moment. And these will be sent directly to the university from whichever organisation administered that test. You'll also be expected to submit a transcript. Now, a transcript is a listing of your academic marks, which will not only include your overall degree grade, but it will also have a breakdown of any modules that you've taken. You can usually ask your department in the UK to provide something like that. Or if not, it will be made clear usually on the university registrar's office page on the university website. So yes, that will be your undergraduate and, if applicable, your master's programs as well, a breakdown of how you fared. Next up, we've got the personal statement, which will describe your academic interests, professional goals, personal goals, and any relevant experience. It's really an opportunity for you to put forth any personal history or context and really to sell yourself to the program. And I'll go over a couple of tips and pointers to bear in mind for that in a moment as well. But I just want to flag here, don't be too British and too modest in these recommendation letters. It's really a space for you to express your passion for your subject choice, and you know, your American counterparts in their essays and personal statements, it's not uncommon for there to be perhaps some storytelling about how they became so passionate about their program. And so it's really a time for you to, you know, don't be too modest about your achievements and things like that. It's really a time to express yourself and your interest in the subject. You'll also be expected usually to have between 2 and 3 recommendation letters. The university might provide some loose guidelines as to who they'd like these to be from. For example, one letter from an academic reference and one from a professional referee. It just depends on the program and the department. But you'll want to be choosing someone who knows you well, both inside and outside of the classroom. And again, we'll go into some more depth about those in just a moment. You'll then have a CV, or what you might see referred to as a resume. This will be a list of professional and extracurricular accomplishments, and these might have some more weight depending on the program that you're involved with, specifically for more professional programs like MBAs, for example. The resume might have a little bit more weight to it. In some cases, you might be asked to do an interview or an audition. An audition is obviously going to be more important for students applying for programs in the arts or performing arts. Art students may also be asked to submit a portfolio of work. And for the interview, again, these tend to have more weight for more professional programs like MBAs. But occasionally research degrees too. It just depends on the program. In terms of that submission of work, as I mentioned, one example might be an art portfolio, while students applying for more research-focused degrees might be asked to submit a writing sample. This might be, you know, a chapter from your undergraduate dissertation that you're really proud of and really, you know, highlights your ability to write well, which is more kind of the focus of that submission of work. It's about how you present your arguments and ideas, rather than perhaps your research itself, because that will come across in other areas of your application. And finally, you will usually be expected to submit a fee for each application that you submit. And this can be anywhere from usually around $50 to $100 per application. So just to flag there that might be something that you want to save up for, particularly if you are applying to several programs in the US. Great. Okay, so how does your academic profile compare to other applicants? And I've listed a few different things that kind of feed into this idea of academic profile. So first up, you've obviously got your grades, which will come across on those transcripts that you'll get from your previous institutions that you studied at. And this is meant to give you a bit of an overview about how universities measure you up as a potential colleague or as a potential student. So you've got your grades, you've got your test scores, which we'll talk about in a minute. You've also got research, so again, any excerpts from your dissertation as part of your undergraduate degree and how that's come across in the application. In some areas, you might also have your work experience. Again, things like MBAs, this might be really important, but other programs, perhaps not so much. And then finally, I've put the X factor, unfortunately not referring to the TV show. However, it's more a sense of this idea of diversity factor, or, you know, something that makes you stand out, and might be to do with, you know, you offering a unique perspective or experience. And it's likely something that will make you very competitive for admission or funding. If you're an international student, perhaps you've had a really unique undergraduate program that can make a strong case as to why you'd bring something unique to their program. Perhaps often universities are looking for an interesting mix of ideas and people in their faculty. And so, you know, you may have some qualities about you that make you unique, that you can include as part of your academic profile. Okay, next up we have got admissions tests. Admissions tests act as an evaluation method due to a lack of sort of national curriculum, and it's just a way for universities to kind of see how students compare to one another. Usually there are a few different tests. As you can see, there are a couple up on screen at the minute. The GRE is kind of the most common one that is applied to several different programs, and this is contains kind of qualitative and quantitative skills as well as some verbal reasoning. And then there are some others that are more specific to particular programs. So the GMAT tends to be for MBAs, the LSAT tends to be for JD programs, for law programs, but not for LLM programs, because those tend to just require a law undergraduate degree, and that's okay. You may also as well have the MCAT for MD programs for medical admissions. Note that admissions tests are, quite different from what we're used to here in the UK in terms of testing. Oftentimes they are multiple choice and very strict on time limits, so it's a very different type of test. And so it's important that if you are going to take one of these, that you are kind of well equipped to know what to expect and have put some time and thought into preparing for them ahead of time. A couple of things to note: a lot of the time we get a question on, how important are standardized tests in the admissions process? The answer is that it's going to depend. Some universities may not require them at all. So again, as you're doing that research process, definitely having a look to see if they are required. I'd recommend that if they're not, that you don't go through the heartache and the expense involved in preparing and taking these exams if they're not required of you. For others, it may factor into their decision, but they're more interested in your personal statement and your transcript. But then there could be, some programs that are really interested in your analytical writing scores and reasoning scores, but aren't as bothered about your quantitative research. It really just depends on the program. And if you're worried about this, this is definitely something that you can ask and try to get a sense of in your research process, and ask that directly to faculty members in the department. A couple of tips for preparing for these tests: if you are going to take one, make sure that you register early for exams. I would suggest that you perhaps sit an exam in sort of in the October before you plan to apply, because this leaves you open to retake in November or December, if that's something that you choose to do. In terms of COVID, I know that the GRE has got some really great systems in place to make the test as accessible as possible. So they're offering a GRE at home program across the world. So definitely have a look out for that if that's relevant for you. And as I mentioned earlier, do make sure that you are preparing for these exams, especially as they are quite pricey to pay for to take. So you want to give it your best shot possible. There are lots of free prep materials online, including linked to on our website, so definitely take a look at those. And there's also the option to buy study guides as well, if you'd like to do that, or in some cases even pay for a tutor. There are lots of different routes involved. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about the personal statement. And this is really a document that can set your application apart from other applicants. As I stressed earlier, this is not like your UCAS application or UCAS personal statement, but instead is an opportunity to really showcase what you can bring to the table. And, you just want to maybe check the university requirements if they give any loose guidelines towards this. But rather than it being an in-depth research proposal, it's more, helps to reveal your character, your motivation, your future goals, an interest in a particular university or program or field. That idea of kind of an in-depth research proposal that many UK universities often have as part of their statement isn't necessarily the case in the US, because you're more expected to develop your research interest and proposals as you move through the program rather than beforehand. In terms of writing your personal statement, there's usually no set structure for what to include. And you really have the opportunity to make yourself stand out and to be creative with this. Some students might choose to start with a quote or an anecdote describing how they became interested in their particular field. Others might use a central theme to link together ideas and describe their experiences and future plans for their studies and their career. So, you know, definitely have a little think about what it is you'd like to include. And again, just to stress, don't be too British or too modest about your achievements. It's really a time to, you know, sell yourself as an applicant. In a similar vein, you'll, as I mentioned, be expected to gather 2 to 3 letters of recommendation from people who know you well. So definitely make sure that you have got someone who knows you well, both in an academic sense and in a sort of extracurricular sense, I suppose. And you'll want to choose referees that really complement your application package and each other, so you'll get a good balance across the 2 to 3 referees that you choose. In terms of the letters itself, again, they're a real marketing tool for you as an applicant. And so you might want to, whilst you won't get to see these letters before they're submitted, you might want to get together with your referees to discuss your application letter. It might be helpful for them as a guide to give them a copy of your CV or your transcript, or perhaps other areas of your application, to disclose with them, you know, what are your big motivations for studying in the US or for studying at this particular program. Some of those, you know, your future goals, why you're so motivated about this program. And to also, I can't stress this enough, to make sure that your referees are really, you know, they know about the deadlines, especially with them varying for different universities, because you don't want them to miss out on those. And finally, just as I put up on screen here, to really encourage your referees to be enthusiastic, positive, and descriptive. American referees will tend to write in a very enthusiastic and positive tone. And so bear in mind how, you know, British Reserve might fare in the context of your American counterparts. You really want for your referees to mirror that enthusiastic tone and to be as enthusiastic as possible. Great, so that kind of wraps up some of those big picture themes for putting together an application. I'm now going to go into talking about funding your studies. Now, funding is one of the top things that we get asked about here at Education USA. And a big misconception is that funding in the US is always, you know, more expensive. Sorry, education in the US is always more expensive than here in the UK. You know, that is not necessarily the case at all. The good news is that there is a significant amount of funding available at the postgraduate level in the US, particularly if you're willing to be open-minded and flexible and strategic about where it is you apply and going into this process. Okay, so with that in mind, where does the money come from? And I have put kind of 4 main sources of funding on the screen, which we'll go through in just a second. First and foremost are personal and sometimes even family funds. This is kind of comes down to a big cultural difference with the US. In the US, there's this culture of saving and paying for university in the same way that we don't have in our loans-based system here in the UK. And so there's a real expectation that you, or sometimes even your family, will make a contribution to your studies. So definitely worth bearing that in mind from the get-go. However, beyond that, there are a few main ways in which UK students tend to fund their studies. The first, and perhaps, you know, the preferred option, is universities themselves in the US. And there are 2 main ways in which this comes about. First up, we've got fellowships or scholarships, which tend to be kind of outright grants that allow for recipients to kind of focus in on their own work. And then assistantships, which tend to be funding in exchange for working on behalf of the department. That might be as a teaching assistant or perhaps grading papers. And sometimes as a result of that, you will get a fee waiver and sometimes even a stipend on top of that, and potentially even having things like health insurance covered as well. Just in terms of availability of both of these, it is really important to be looking at the department website, because not all universities will have both of these on offer, and also they will vary in how competitive they are. Some universities at a large department, perhaps they have 500 students and they're only able to offer 30 assistantships per year, whereas in a smaller university that is perhaps a little bit more off the beaten track, they might have 15 spots in their program and they might have 15 assistantships. So having a sense of what percentage of students are offered these types of funding and scholarships is a really important thing to be doing as you go through your research process. Next up, we have external funding bodies. Again, we'll go through an example of what some of these look like in just a moment. But these tend to be, niche scholarships that are separate from the US university, and might be companies, charities, foundations who tend to offer smaller amounts of funding that might be used to kind of supplement things like flights or cost of living as well. Finally, and as a kind of last resort, we have put up loans on the board. Now, you are unfortunately unable to take a UK student loan with you to the US. And so it's really important that if you are going to take out a US loan, note that most US lenders will require a US citizen to co-sign that loan with you. Therefore, most UK citizens will take out a private third-party loan in the UK from a bank, but we'd highly encourage you to seek out, professional financial advice and make sure that you've examined the terms and interest rates very closely before committing to a loan, because sometimes there are high payback rates on these third-party loans that perhaps you're also required to start paying back whilst you're still completing your studies and perhaps aren't in full-time employment to help contribute towards that. So just really caution you on that point. However, if you are an American citizen or you do have dual US-UK citizenship, for example, note that you can take out a loan from a US lender, or you can also apply for US federal loans through FAFSA. So definitely encourage you to look into that option if that applies to you. So a couple of things that you can consider as part of your funding strategy to kind of lower costs and to manage some of those expenses that we just talked about. First off is the cost of living and kind of lowering that. So there are a couple of different approaches that you might take. First off, I just want to highlight this idea of rural versus urban, which is very much the same as how we would imagine it to be here in the UK. If you're going to be studying somewhere like LSE or UCL in central London, your living costs are going to be a lot higher than if you were to study somewhere like Lancaster University, for example. So that idea of cost of living in different areas of the country definitely rings true to the US. If you are slap bang in the middle of New York City, for example, your cost of living is going to be much, much higher than if you're somewhere like Vermont or Michigan. So having a look at different areas of the US that perhaps you are not as familiar with can really help you to lower that cost of living down. Next up, you can seek out programs with lower cost of tuition. As I alluded to earlier on in the presentation, public universities, which mean state-funded universities, generally have lower costs of tuition than do private universities. However, and we'll get onto this in just a second, private universities may have more availability of funding opportunities, and funding will vary by department within each university. So that's just something to kind of caveat and to bear in mind. And then third and finally is that availability of university funding. Could you look for universities that offer more funding or departments that offer more funding? And also perhaps you could have a think about your program on your interests. Is there a possibility for you to seek funding outside of your department? is there that interdisciplinary nature to your work that you might be able to seek funding from an additional department as well. Just a caution on this as well, you may not be able to use all three of these strategies all at once. There may be a bit of a trade-off where you can use one or two of them together. You might find that universities with lower tuition rates have less university funding and vice versa. So just being aware of some of those different factors at play. Just to give you a bit of an example of this, I've pulled up two different universities. So on the left, we have got Boston University, and on the right, we've got UMass, University of Massachusetts. And so just to give you an idea, at Boston University's Department of Education and Human Development program, tuition and fees come to over $72,000 a year, compared to the University of Massachusetts, where tuition and off-campus finances would be less than $25,000 a year. So sometimes as well, as is the case with these two universities, if you are a student at UMass, you are actually able to enroll at certain classes at Boston University. So you'll essentially be taking some of that same programming, but for a much lower cost. So sometimes universities that are close by to one another have links and relationships with each other. And this really is an example just to highlight that these universities are in the same city, but have a really great variance in tuition and fees. And just to emphasize that idea of being open-minded and strategic, especially if funding is a consideration and important for you. Okay. In terms of funding opportunities and locating them as part of your research process, I'm going to go through a quick example of what that looks like. But your best resource for finding opportunities for funding is going to be on the university website. It might be on the department website, it might be on the graduate school website, and in some cases, there'll also be a separate kind of set of financial aid pages. Make sure that you check all three, because they may not be advertised centrally. It might be a case of kind of trawling through those pages just to double check that you have explored all avenues. I would say, have a check about what these pages say. Do they have a lot of funding available, or are funding places quite limited and competitive to access? Universities generally try to give you an accurate but conservative look at funding and how much funding it is that they offer. So if this information isn't readily online, it might suggest that they can't offer a lot of funding, but it's worth getting in touch with the departmental administrator just in case you've missed something, in case it's not very clearly advertised. And as I was saying as well, you might want to take a look at this idea of what are you going to be competitive for funding at a particular university? Are there particular additional requirements that you need to fulfill in order to apply for funding, or are you automatically considered for funding as part of the general application period? So let's just have a look at an example or two, just to see what it is that you're going to be looking for on the university website. Okay, this is a screenshot from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is a top public research university in the US. And as you can see in red, just to kind of highlight some of what you'll be looking for, we have highlighted some kind of key points about fellowships and assistantships and how to identify when a university does have funding available. So as you can see on their Department of Political Science website, they have written, and I'll just read out these bits highlighted in red. Most students in the Department of Political Science are supported by fellowships and assistantships, eligible for a variety of competitive university-wide fellowships. And we also get this idea that Chapel Hill is a highly livable college town with a low cost of living. So again, that strategy piece coming into play. So as you can see, most universities that are generous with funding will make it quite known and obvious on their website. And we can also see here that it explains that duties for the assistantships typically range from 10 to 15 hours per week during the 9-month academic year. And some of the types of duties that you'll be expected to complete, like teaching in an elementary course, conducting sections, or assisting a faculty member in research and teaching. And we also get this idea of variety of university-wide fellowships as well. So definitely having a look at some of those opportunities and double checking those 3 different areas of the university's website that might give you some detail and insights into what's on offer in terms of finances. I also want to show a quick example of external funding. Now, this is just one example from the Fulbright Commission, which is the Fulbright Awards. And it's one example of an external funding body that is out there. So the Fulbright Awards offer a range of different types of awards, and you can check those out on our website. They do vary from year to year, but they are aimed at, our All Disciplines Award at least, is aimed at covering the first year of study. And so other partner awards might be fully funded, so you can check the website for more detail on that. The number of awards that are offered each year fluctuates, and the deadline tends to be in early November for enrolment in the following academic year. So if you are applying for admission in 2022, applications will open in the late summertime, I believe, and close in November. So definitely something to be aware of. If you do have more questions on that, you can definitely get in touch with our Fulbright Awards team, and their email address is up on screen. But again, definitely check out the website because they do have a lot of information about the awards on there. Okay, so just to kind of give an overview about our top funding tips from us at Education USA. Applying for funding, as I mentioned, often happens simultaneously with the application process. It doesn't usually come after. It's normally something that works alongside. So definitely make sure that you're looking into funding early as you are doing your university research. If funding is a big consideration for you, you must be willing to put in the extra time and effort to seek out those opportunities. Scholarships are not going to come to you, and so it's really important to take those, take the time to investigate different universities that perhaps you hadn't considered before, and to take the time to search for these often niche scholarship opportunities that take place externally. In terms of funding, the best resource again is university funding. And you want to be looking at the department, the graduate school, and the financial aid pages to just double check that you've exhausted all options there. And another thing to note is that you are able to, on many student visas, to apply for an on-campus job, and you can usually work up to 20 hours a week during term time and 40 hours a week during the holidays. However, these jobs can't be factored in for visa purposes. They're more just something that you can use to contribute to things like your cost of living while you're out there. So definitely worth keeping that in mind ahead of time, because you will need to be able to, in order to apply for your visa, to prove that you've got the funds to pay for your studies. Great. Okay. Just before we move into the Q&A section then, I'm going to quickly go over a few ways in which we can help beyond this webinar. First and foremost, I've referenced it a lot tonight so far. We have got our website, which has got a plethora of really great resources that you can refer to throughout the process. If you visit our Going to the USA section, there's a drop down for our postgraduate guide, which has got lots of detail on choosing a university, finding funding, and also putting together an application. And we also have the Fulbright Awards section, which has got details about each award category, the benefits, selection process, as well as that contact information for our awards team. Here at Education USA, we also take questions by phone and by email. We check the inbox every single day and try to get back within a week. And our advising line is open Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. So we're more than happy to help you out with questions as you go through the process. And finally, we also have events about US study, majority online at the moment, but as well in person whenever we are next able to, as the situation progresses with COVID. And we also attend a variety of postgraduate fairs throughout the year, like Find a PhD, for example, where you can come and talk to us. We're hoping to have a postgraduate fair sometime soon. That we'll be running ourselves with US universities, so definitely keep an eye out for that. Great. So I know I have been talking for quite a while now, and we're now going to move into the Q&A section. So if you do have any questions, I definitely encourage you to pop them in the Q&A box. I'll ask that you keep these questions quite general, so that they can be helpful for the benefit of everyone in the group. And if you do have more individual or niche questions that are quite specific to your circumstances, that you maybe write us an email or get in touch on the phone for us. If you do need to dip out at this point as well, I just want to say thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll of course be sending a copy of the recording to you all as soon as we can, so you can definitely check out the Q&A another time if that suits you. I'm just going to give everyone a moment to pop any questions into the chat, to the Q&A box, and then we'll get started. Okay. First question we have is, do US universities tend to have open days where we can visit them? Great question. So in terms of COVID at the moment, I know it's very difficult to physically go and visit a US university. However, as a result of that, many US universities have got really in-depth platforms online, whether that's a virtual tour, whether that's virtual information sessions, and a really great way to kind of get a sense of what a university is all about and what it is that their student body gets involved with, etc., is to actually check out their social media pages, whether that's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Lots of really cool opportunities to get to know a university there. However, kind of when circumstances allow, many US universities do tend to have open days in person as well, where students can go and visit or do a campus tour. And again, that idea of getting in touch with faculty is a really great place to start, particularly at the postgraduate level, to get a sense of what research is being done at the moment and how you'd be able to get involved online. What is the phone number for the advice line? All of our contact details can be found on our website, fulbright.org.uk, and so I'd encourage you to go and double check that out. Does the Fulbright Scholarship only support 1 year? Will you not receive the same funding in the second year? For example, if you're doing a 2-year master's program. So yes, the All Discipline Award for the Fulbright Awards aims to cover that first year of study. And so if you are applying for the All Disciplines Award, you might then need to have a think about alternative methods of funding that would help you support that second year of study. However, there are some partner awards and things like that that are with a particular university or perhaps are to do with a specific field that may be able to cover, you know, the whole program or more of the program. And so it's really a case of finding the award that best fits your circumstances. And of course, you might be able to access university funding on top of that, because of course the Fulbright Awards is just one example of an external funding body. Perhaps you'd be able to apply for another external funding body, for example, to fund your second year. So just something to bear in mind. And if you do have more specific questions on the Fulbright Awards, definitely contact our awards team at programs@fulbright.org.uk, because they'll be able to give you the most up-to-date and best advice for your situation. Similarly, we've got a question, is there a minimum undergraduate grade to be eligible for a Fulbright scholarship? I believe usually it's a 2-1 or above that is considered in terms of academics. However, if you do have any particular context that you believe has influenced getting a lower grade perhaps, and that is something that you can discuss with the programs team, again by getting in touch via email, and they'll be able to advise you better from there. Great question. Does one application fee cover multiple program applications at the same university? Great question, Anna. That is going to depend totally on the university and what their system looks like. So if you do have questions about that, I would recommend checking in with the departments that you're applying to within the same university to see what that looks like. Usually, if you're applying to separate programs at different universities, you'll have to pay that fee each time. However, it will just depend on the university if you're applying to 2 different departments within that same university as to what that looks like. Due to COVID, could we study through the Fulbright program online with universities in the US? Raywin, that's a great question. I am not 100% sure what the take from our Fulbright Awards team is on this. So again, it would definitely be something that I would encourage you to double check, see if it's on their FAQ page on the website, or alternatively to discuss your particular circumstances with the Fulbright Awards team, because they're going to be best placed to advise you on that. Okay, Evie has asked, what is the difference between a fellowship and a scholarship? Great question. So both of these are going to be kind of grants, I suppose. So that kind of means money that you won't necessarily have to pay back, which is great. That's probably one of the top reasons in which we encourage students to look into these. They're largely the same. It's more kind of a terminology difference, but it will just depend on the university, on the kind of specifics of what these look like. In some cases, a fellowship might be tied to a specific set of criteria. So they might want for you to focus on a particular research topic within the faculty, for example, and same goes for a scholarship. So it's more of a terminology difference, but it will just depend on the university as to what the logistics of both fellowships and scholarships look like at individual departments and universities. Okay. If we are applying for PhD programs in the US from the UK, are we generally expected to have a master's already from a UK university? No, that is not the case. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, PhD programs in the US tend to kind of have an integrated master's as part of them. And so in your first 1 to 2 years, you will be doing, if you already have a master's, from the UK, a lot of the work that you are doing might be familiar from your master's. But it is that opportunity to kind of hone in on any skills, and it's usually not an optional part of the process. And so no, not at all. It's not an expectation that you already have a master's. You can go straight in to a PhD program with an undergraduate degree in the US. Great. Okay, I think that is the last question that I have received. So thank you all so much for joining me this evening. I hope that this has been helpful and given you a bit of an insight into postgraduate study in the US. As I say, if you do have any questions from here, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us by email or via phone. We are more than happy to help. And other than that, I hope you all have a lovely evening and take care. All the very best. Thank you.